When I was a kid, someone said to me, "There's nothing new under the sun." And I thought, that's crazy. I can think of lots of new stuff. Like, I can go down to the Nike store anytime I want and buy a new pair of high tops. That's not what he meant. What he meant was anything that seems new, like, for example, skinny jeans. It's not really new. It's really a redo of something from a long time ago. The same thing happens with stories. When authors write stories, they actually use bits and pieces of old stories, and they just tell them in a new way or in a combination. The older you get and the more you read, you'll start to see this happen more, but it can be tricky to you when you're first starting out as a reader and you just don't know all the old stories. To be a good reader, people expect you to know the old stories, so that when you're reading a text, if a bit of an old story pops up in there, you can say, aha, there's that old character, or there's that old plot, or that setting, or that theme. That's the same as that one old story called whatever. So I'm going to help you out with this today, and I'm going to tell you 4 famous old stories that a lot of authors use when they're writing their new stories. So the next time you're reading a text, you can see if there's anything in your new text that matches up with these old stories. The first story I'm going to tell you is called David and Goliath. It's from the Hebrew Bible, and it takes place thousands of years ago. There was a war going on between 2 groups of people. One group was called the Israelites, and one group was called the Philistines. Now, both armies were on each side of a huge valley, and one guy from the Philistine side stepped out into the valley and he shouted out a challenge to the Israelites, and he said, instead of us all fighting each other, just send me one guy down here to fight me, and whoever wins the fight between the 2 of us, he'll win the whole war for his army. But Goliath was huge. He was a giant, and he had these huge weapons and all this protective armor, and the Israelites were afraid. The only person who wasn't afraid to fight him was a little boy named David. David didn't have any armor, and the only weapon that he had was a sling and 5 stones. The king tried to stop him, and the king tried to give him armor, but David said no, that he wasn't afraid. He went out to face Goliath, and he slung one of the stones, and the stone hit Goliath right in the forehead really hard. It knocked him out, and he fell down. And then David used Goliath's own sword to kill him and then chop off his head. Now, you might hear parts of this story in another story. If you were reading a story about a little kid who stands up to a big bully that everybody else is afraid of at school, or if you read a story about someone who becomes a superhero even though everybody else thinks that she's really weak. Another story from the Hebrew Bible is the story of Jonah. Jonah was a prophet of God, and a prophet is someone who tells other people what a God is going to do in the future. Now, Jonah's God told him that he needed to go to a city called Nineveh because the people there had become really evil. And God wanted Jonah to tell the people there to stop being evil. But Jonah decided that he wasn't going to go. He didn't want to go there and do that job. So instead he gets on a ship headed for another city called Tarshish, which is in like the opposite direction. And once Jonah gets on the boat and the boat gets on the sea, God makes a big storm come up. And the sailors that are on the boat get really afraid. They're afraid the ship's going to break and it's going to sink. And so Jonah tells them, hey guys, the reason that this storm is happening is because I'm running away from what God told me to do. So they push Jonah out of the boat into the ocean. And once they do, the storm ends immediately. And then a big fish comes up and it swallows Jonah. It doesn't kill him, it just swallows him, and he lives inside its belly for 3 days. And after that, then he's willing to actually go to Nineveh and do the job that God told him to do. And so the fish spits him out, and he goes and he does the job that God told him to do. That's the end of the story. But you might see parts of this story if you were to read a story about a kid who knows that his grandma needs his help, but he keeps trying to avoid helping her. Or a story about a little girl who knows that her destiny is to be president, but she keeps running away from it. The next story is called Achilles. It's from the country of Greece, thousands of years ago. People in Greece told a lot of stories called myths that were about heroes or gods or just people who got into a lot of trouble. Achilles was a hero. From the moment he was born, there were a lot of prophecies or fortunes made about his future that said that he would be a great warrior, and also that he would die in a war against another country called Troy. His mother heard that prophecy, and she didn't want it to come true. She didn't want him to die. So she took him to a magical river called the River Styx, and she dipped him in the river, and everywhere the water touched, he became invincible. So he did become a great warrior. He actually became the greatest warrior in all of Greece, and he won lots and lots of battles. But eventually, when he was fighting in the war against Troy, he did die when an arrow hit him in the heel. It turns out that when his mother dipped him in the River Styx, she was holding him by his heel, and the water didn't touch that part. So he turned out not to be invincible in that one part of his body. You might see parts of this story if you were to read a story about a football player who seems like the perfect player, and he wins and wins and wins, but he has some kind of a secret weakness that maybe not even he knows, and that one weakness causes him to lose. Another story from ancient Greece is the story of a man named Narcissus. Narcissus was an extremely beautiful man. Every woman who saw him fell in love with him and wanted to be with him, but he turned them all away. What he said to them was, "I'll die before I give you power over me." He thought that loving another person would make him weak. One of the women that he hurt prayed to the gods, and she said, "Make the one who doesn't love other people love himself instead." And the gods heard this prayer, and they answered it. So the next time that Narcissus saw his reflection in a pool of water, he fell in love with his own reflection. He couldn't stop looking at it, and he couldn't leave the pool, so he died there, all alone. You might see parts of this story in a story about a girl who turns down every guy who asks her to the school dance because she wants to look strong. But in the end, she ends up lonely while everybody else at the dance feels connected to each other. So the next time you're reading a text, check to see if it has any parts of these old stories in it. Now, there are lots of other old stories that you need to know too, not just these 4. So if you're interested in reading more stories from the Hebrew Bible, check out the book Biblical Literacy by Timothy Beale. And if you're interested in reading more stories from ancient Greek mythology, check out the book Mythology by Edith Hamilton. Now, get out there and read.